Hello and welcome to Copper's Corner, your music history podcast. I'm Copper Kelly, your host, and this week we're going to talk about Elvis Presley, the host of another podcast that's called Concerts That Made Us podcast, and his name is Brian O'Connor. Hello, Brian, and thanks for joining us.
Hey, Copper, how's things? I'm delighted to join you.
Not so bad, not so bad. I actually appeared on your podcast, when was it now? A few months ago now, I think, at this stage, was it?
Jeez, it must be about 4 or 5 months ago, is it?
Yeah. And Brian has a great podcast by himself, and we'll talk about that now in a second. But today's subject is Elvis Presley, and Brian picked Elvis as his, I suppose, favourite singer, one of the favourite singers of all time anyway.
I did.
So we're going to get into the life and times of Elvis Presley. Before we get into that, if you want to follow the podcast on social media, go over to Copper's Corner Podcast on Instagram, Facebook, and you can support the podcast over on patreon.com/Copper's Corner Podcast. Keeps the wheels a turning and the fires a burning. But yourself, Brian, if they want to find out where they can listen to the Concerts That Made Us podcast, where can they find you?
Yeah, so it's available on all your favourite pod players. The best place is probably the website at www.concertsthatmadeus.com, and you'll find out all the info about that. So I interview guests about their concert experiences, their music influences. I've had many famous musicians on, like Copper, less known musicians like Nine Inch Nails. It's a good mix. There's up and coming artists and the odd famous one thrown into the mix, but we generally have fun, have a good old chat. Copper's episode would be a good one to start.
I think I had the record at the time as being the longest episode that you had recorded. Has that been beaten since, I think, is it?
It has. It was actually beaten by, I think, 3 minutes by your good friend Mark from Star Comedy Democrats.
Yes, he beat me by 3 minutes. Oh, I think we got, 2 hours out of it or something like that? So we had a good old chat.
Yeah, it was just over 2 hours. Yeah. And we probably could have kept going.
Of course, what I like about your podcast, you ask the guest, what's their first concert, what's their last concert, favourite concert, the worst concert, and this kind of thing. And it's just it makes for a really good conversation. I think I've said to you before, when you're listening to it, kind of time just kind of melts away, and it's really, really enjoyable to listen to. But I suppose, what made you start the podcast in the first place?
Well, for the last couple of years, I got into podcasts maybe about 5 or 6 years ago. And I suppose, like many people, I was always thinking I'd love to make my own podcast, but I couldn't think of what it'd be appealable or what I could do it on that I'd be interested in. Because like most podcasts, they'll start off and then 8, 9 episodes in, the host will get bored and it'll just die away.
Yeah.
So I wanted to make sure it was something that I'd stick at. So last year with the pandemic, there was no live music. I love going to concerts. So I thought to myself, I can't be the only person that misses concerts. And you know what's good crack? Talking about concerts. So let's start a podcast and ask people on to hear their concert stories. That way, if there's a band that you've always wanted to see, maybe they haven't come to your country yet, there could be someone on the podcast that has seen them, and they'll have some cool stories that you can hear,
Yeah, like my mate Mark Bulger here, he travelled around Europe following Pearl Jam, and that was an interesting episode. He had all sorts of ups and downs in that one.
It was. I've always wondered myself what it'd be like to follow a band on tour, around Europe or around the world. And he was the first guest now that I've had on that actually did that.
Yeah.
It was a great episode. Lots of very interesting adventures along that.
Yeah. It was a brilliant one. Sure. Yeah, you've had lots of different singers and I suppose musicians that have played with big names in all of music pretty much. You had one guy who played with Slash and this kind of stuff as well, isn't that right?
Yeah. I think that could be Eric Ferrantinos you were talking about. He's kind of an 80s hair metal guitarist, and he's played with all the greats from that era. He was an interesting character. It was a fairly mental episode now.
Yeah.
But another guy that had played with some legends was Ivan Funkboy Bodley. He's in the Blues Hall of Fame, and He's played with all the legends from, R&B and blues and Motown down throughout the years. I think he constantly tours with Sam Moore from Sam and Dave.
All right.
He had some cool stories as well.
Yeah, Janie Mac, yeah. That's a great podcast. Anyone listen now, if you want another good podcast to listen to, apart from Copper's Corner, that is, of course, go over to Conscious That Made Us and do make sure to follow and listen to any future episodes. I think you're starting season 2. You're getting ready to start season 2 soon, isn't it?
Yeah, it'll be out as of recording. It'll be out in 2 weeks' time. So I think that's just near the end of September.
Perfect. Yeah, that's great. So you picked Elvis Presley for the topic of conversation today. I suppose if listeners don't know, I always ask the guests who they'd like to talk about. I don't basically tell them, oh, we're going to talk about such and such. I ask the guests, it's up to them. And then that kind of gives me an opening to learn about musicians that I had not basically known so much about, and I researched them and that kind of thing. And of course, you picked Elvis Presley. I suppose what made you pick Elvis Presley to talk about? Well,
he was, I think I was telling you before, I've listened to your podcast and I thought to myself, geez, if I was on that, there's only one person I could talk about, and that's Elvis. Like, he started it all. He was the first one to come along and change the music scene. He truly is the king of rock and roll. If Elvis had never been, there probably wouldn't be any Beatles, any Led Zeppelin. The music scene down through the generations would be completely different, And he was the coolest guy ever, There's an old saying about him, women wanted to be with him and men wanted to be him, But he was the first global superstar, and he had it all.
Absolutely.
And I'm sure we'll get into it now and hear all about the things he did.
Yeah, absolutely. We go through his life. And as I said, like I grew up knowing obviously who Elvis is, but I never, deep dived into his music or his background as much as I have in the last few days researching this for this episode. But yeah, it's a fascinating story, and it's massive story as well. I don't think we can hope to definitively cover everything in the next hour or so. So
no, I think you'd actually need a podcast dedicated
just about Elvis. Yeah. Just to give you a scope of some figures on his career. In his time, he filmed 31 movies. He did 784 songs he recorded in the studio, and he played 1,684 concerts. But that might not sound like a huge amount for an artist as big as him, but he had kind of periods where he didn't tour for 10 years. Then all of a sudden he was touring 2 shows a day for months on end, kind of thing.
Yeah.
So it's
he had the couple of years when he was in the army where he couldn't tour. Then he had as you said, the 10 years where he was signed to a contract in Hollywood making questionable movies.
We'll get to them as well in time.
Yeah. And sure, then after his comeback, he launched into Vegas, and he was doing that until he died. Constant tour and 2 shows a day.
Yeah,
take its toll on you.
Constant struggle in his life, and he obviously died very young. Was it 42? I think he was when he died.
Yeah.
And obviously we'll get to that. But I suppose we'll start at the start. And Elvis Presley was born Elvis Aaron Presley in January 8th of 1935 in Tupelo, Mississippi.
He was a twin, actually. Did you? Yeah, he was a twin. So I think just after he was born, the other baby came along, but unfortunately it was stillborn. That baby's name was Jesse Garin. So like you said, his name was Elvis Aaron. Yeah. Jesse Garin was his brother. And that had a very big impact on his life going forward as well. Because I'm not sure if you were going to mention it later, but his mother used to tell him that it's kind of weird. His brother's life force went into him. So inside him, he had Elvis and Jesse. And that kind of played heavily on his mind, especially in his later years. There's stories of him, when he used to feel down or whatever, he'd go into a room, turn off the lights, shine a lamp from the side, and he'd talk to his shadow as if he was talking to his brother.
Oh, wow. That's amazing, yeah. And of course, he was very close to his mother as well.
He was some think that he had a kind of an odd relationship with his mother. He was extremely close. They had their own little language that only the two of them could understand. He used to actually sleep in sleep in the bed with his mother. That was odd. Sleep in the bed with his mother until a very late age as well. So he was incredibly close.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. But yeah, like he, when he was younger, I think he got a job as a truck driver in order to basically pay his way into get some recording sessions of basically get some demos done with a band consisting of himself, guitar Scotty Moore, and bassist Bill Black. And I suppose his influences from a very early age were very heavily into blues and country and gospel music. So country, myself being a country musician, can relate to the country side of things. He was very influenced by that, but also the blues and the R&B as well, rhythm blues, you could call it back in the day. And of course, the gospel, the whole religious side of it, and it played heavily into his music from the early days. It did go off into a different direction later on in his career. He had a flamboyant, I suppose, personality from a young age, and he was actually very shy though when he was going to school. Oh yeah.
He wasn't very popular, and for one of his birthdays he got a guitar, which was a major thing. As you said, they were very poor, and there was a couple of years where his father had went to prison. So his father had sold a pig to a guy, and he had signed the wrong figure on the check. And the father thought to himself, I'll just add in an extra digit there. But he got caught. I think he got sentenced to maybe 3 years. So that was very tough. And it was probably one of the poorest times in their life. They had to, they lost the house they were living in, the little shotgun shack that he was born in.
Yeah.
They had to move in with relatives, and his mother Gladys had to do a lot of odd jobs and taking in other people's washing and laundry and just to stay afloat. But I think that's something else that influenced him, or was kind of weighed heavy on his mind for the rest of his life.
Yeah.
Because when he started making money, he would buy his mother everything she ever wanted, even stuff she didn't want. Like, he bought her loads of Cadillacs, and he had an obsession with Cadillacs in the 50s.
Yeah.
He bought his mother Cadillacs, and he wouldn't ever buy his father anything. If his father wanted something, he gave him a job and made him work for it. Like the Cadillac, for instance, he bought his mother the Cadillac, and then he paid his dad to be her chauffeur. You know, so he was very tough on his father. He'd never give him anything for free. He always made him work for it. But I know you mentioned...
the thing is with his mother as well, he said that his mother never asked for anything either. He probably just bought her everything, but she never asked for anything, and she didn't want anything like that. And that's always why I suppose he had a big affection for her that way as well. She wasn't trying to get anything out of him and anything like that. But yeah, sorry, go on what you're saying there.
That's another reason why, or a main reason why he bought Graceland as well, his famous house. It was for his parents to have a proper big house that they wouldn't want for anything, you know?
Yeah.
And of course he was going to live there as well. But I was just going to say is when you mentioned the recording contract and he wanted to record with the band.
Yeah.
When he was 18, he was working as a truck driver.
Yeah.
And he wanted to, tying into his affection for his mother, he wanted to record himself singing for her as a gift for her birthday.
Right.
And he went in, and I think it was a song called My Happiness. Went in. In those days, you could go to the local recording studio in town, and pay. I think he paid $4, which back in, it was 1953, 54. That was a lot of money, especially when he was, 18 years of age, driving a truck around, probably not getting paid a whole lot.
No, it's probably a few weeks' wages at least, anyway.
Yeah, exactly. Especially down in the south, I'm sure, in poorer areas. But the lady that was working there, the secretary, took a shine to him. Her name was, I think it was Marion Keister.
Right.
Took a shine to him, and she stuck in his mind. And a couple of weeks later, Sam Phillips, the head of the recording shop there. He was on the search for months for this new artist. He wanted an artist that was white, but sounded like a colored person or like a black person and sang like a black person.
Yeah.
Because the area they're in, it was full of black musicians and, you know, the R&B, blues, you know. So there was, you know, segregation back then. You know, they couldn't really play black people on the radio.
Yeah, the civil rights movement hasn't really started at all at this stage.
Exactly.
It's maybe murmurings of it, but it's kind of still very old-fashioned times there.
Yeah. So he was a great fan of that type of music, but he wanted to be able to play it. So he wanted to find a white singer who could sound exactly like them. So a couple of weeks after Elvis had made the record for his mother, Marion, the secretary, said to him, I think I might have found the perfect guy. This young guy came in a couple of weeks ago and recorded this song. He's brilliant. You should listen to him. So he called Elvis in and he got a couple of session musicians, Scotty Moore and Bill Black. His name? Bill Black.
Bill Black,
yeah. He got them in to back him up. And they were there the whole day. Elvis was singing ballads and slow songs. And Sam, say it for me.
Bill Black or Sam
Phillips.
Sam Phillips.
Yeah, nothing was really jumping out at him. You know, he thought it was the same thing he sees every day when people are trying out. You know, and he was the day was coming to a close anyway, and he was getting kind of more and more fed up. And he was like, "Right, guys, I think we better pack it up." So Elvis was obviously disappointed. He thought he'd missed his big shot. So he turned around to the two guys and he was like, "Hey, do you know That's All Right, Mama?" And he said, "Just follow me, I'll start playing it." And for any listeners that are familiar with that song, it's not a slow song, it's very upbeat.
Yeah.
And the minute you start playing it, then Sam Phillips's ears perked up and he was like, "Oh my God, press record on this straight away. This is it. I've found my guy." I always think to myself, imagine if that little moment hadn't happened. You know, there'd be no Elvis.
Just a sudden split thought, hey, let's just do the song, rock it up a bit. It basically became rockabilly. They dubbed it rockabilly, that sound, a kind of fast-paced rock and roll. And it kind of retained some of this kind of blues influence on it as well. But yeah, I think that was his first major hit anyway, was That's All Right in July of 1954. And he was recording with Sun Records over the next year. He had songs like Mystery Train. And so he started making live appearances in regional roadhouses and clubs. And he eventually had radio performance on the Louisiana Hayride, which we actually referenced in the last episode. Hank Williams, he was a mainstay on that back in the day. He started to become popular, getting hits out there. And then Mr. Colonel Tom Parker began to come into the picture. What's your initial thoughts on Colonel Tom Parker? He was Elvis's manager for basically all the rest of his life. Yeah.
I wouldn't have much good thoughts on him now, knowing what I know about him. Sure, he was great, launching him to stardom and, you know, getting him in. He was kind of like one of these old, old circus managers or old, I suppose in Ireland we'd call them gangsters, but a real wheeler and dealer kind of slimy, slick guy.
Greasy kind of a...
Yeah. And he came in and there was another guy managing Elvis at the time, and he came in and spoke to his parents and basically told them he could get them the world. You know, he really wowed them with all his fast talk and everything and won them over. And he was actually from, I think, Netherlands or...
Yes, Breda in the Netherlands.
That's
true.
And
I looked into his past a little bit more. Of course, he kept it hidden for many years. As far as the world knew at the time, his name was Thomas Andrew Parker, and he was born in Huntington in West Virginia shortly after 1900. And he had toured with carnivals and worked with elephants and managed a palm reading booth before basically becoming a music promoter in the 1950s. But the thing is, Parker never held a US passport. Although he did serve in the army, he did serve as a colonel. He was actually a private, and he went absent without leave. He went AWOL for a time in 1932, and he served seven several months in military prison for desertion. But then he was only released after he had a psychotic breakdown where he was diagnosed as a psychopath, and he was discharged from the army. And then a few years later, when World War II was happening, there was the draft, and Parker ate and ate and ate until he weighed more than 300 pounds in order to get the upper limit of the weight so he wouldn't have to be fit for service, let's say.
That's dedication.
Yeah. His history started to kind of come out, and towards the end of his life anyway, he actually was, he was from Breda in the Netherlands, but he was obviously saying he was from West Virginia, and he's born there in 1909, and is the seventh child of a delivery driver. His real name was actually, I'll say this right now, Andreas van Kujic. I'm guessing. I'm not very good on my Dutch.
Sounds good.
But there's actually, I don't know if you heard about this. This is all allegedly and circumstantial, I guess.
I think I know where you're going.
Yeah, you think I know where you're going? Apparently in 1929, he was still in Breda at this time, but he effectively overnight left and travelled to the US without a penny in his pocket, pretty much. He left all his clothes behind, left everything, and didn't tell anyone where he's going. And the reason that they potentially think, now this hasn't been proven or anything, but there was a murder on that same night of a young 23-year-old Anna van den Enden. She was a grocer's wife that had been beaten to death. But people can kind of link it, not just, it's kind of circumstantial evidence, but basically she was killed on that day and he left town that night and made a new life from new identities, all that kind of stuff for himself in America. What have you've heard of that story before, have you?
I have, and I'd be very inclined to believe that it's true.
Yeah.
Knowing how he behaved later in life. But that's actually the sole reason why Elvis Presley never performed outside of America.
Yeah.
Because the colonel wouldn't let him out of his grips to go over there without him.
Yeah.
And if the colonel left, he was first of all afraid if they went near the Netherlands, he'd be, arrested. But there was not a hope he was getting back into America. So his life was over if he left America. So he wouldn't let Elvis leave. He
was technically an illegal immigrant in the US and didn't have a passport. So if he went out, he might not come back in. But even saying that though, there was an amnesty for illegal immigrants sometime in the 1940s. 1940. And he could have been offered an amnesty, but he didn't take it for some reason. And he also, as Elvis's star began to rise, he could have actually reached out to senators or even Lyndon Johnson, the president at the time. He could have just called him up and say, hey, you need some citizenship there, will you?
Yeah, exactly.
He could have done it, but he never did for some reason. Basically kept Elvis in America. I think Elvis actually only played outside of America 3 times, and that was Canada. So, and your man, he didn't even cross over with him. Colonel Parker didn't cross over with him. So that's a big, in one sense, he put Elvis in the right place at the right time in order to make him famous. But on the other hand, one hand he gave, and the other hand he took away. Especially since apparently he took 50% of all of Elvis's earnings, which would be millions upon millions and millions and millions. And I actually read here somewhere his first, I suppose, contract with Elvis, he arranged for Presley's song catalogue and recording contract to be sold to a major New York City based enterprises, Hill and Range and RCA Victor. So Sun Records, for this, they received a sum of $35,000, which is a lot of money back then.
Yeah.
But Elvis got $5,000 of that for his songs, his performances. He got $5,000, and I'm sure Tom Parker would have got a sizable chunk more than Elvis for that.
More than likely.
Yeah. Of course, Tom Parker, he was an avid gambler as well, especially in the Las Vegas days.
He was. There's a story one of Elvis's bodyguards tells that
part of the Memphis Mafia.
Yeah. Tom Parker was down at the roulette or the craps table, and he had bet, I think, something like $100,000 and lost it. And he asked your man how much money he had and on him. And he was like, no, get away from me. None of them guys liked the Colonel, you know?
Yeah.
But he got it off him anyway. He was like, look, I'm going to win. If you win on this, like, you'll get more than double what you gave me. Of course, he lost it. He was addicted to gambling, but he was also useless at gambling. You know?
That's true.
But that's one of the reasons why Elvis apparently toured so much near the end of his life, you know, that it was constant touring. Apparently the Colonel owed everybody money. Like, he was in debt for millions. And the only way, of course, he was going to make enough money was have Elvis touring every single day.
Yeah,
you know? Exactly.
I think there's one story of Tom Parker losing 1.5 million in a night as well. Just bonkers. And there's another story where another of the Memphis Mafia, who were kind of, I suppose, Elvis's closest friends. They're his bodyguards and it's kind of assistants, maybe you could say, but he's basically kind of close friends that kind of kept this kind of tight circle.
All guys he went to school with and met in the army, and he decided when he got big, he brought them along with him. He hired them, you know, as bodyguards. He got them parts in the movies, you know, he gave them all jobs. When Elvis liked you and thought of you as a friend, he'd look after you, you know. He was very generous. I'd say he ended up giving away more stuff than he actually, you know, more money than he made.
Yeah.
But he always said that he loved his favorite thing in life was the expression on someone's face when he gave them something. You know, he said that made him so happy. Like, there's stories of he was going into a car dealership to buy a car for himself and all the bodyguards. And as I mentioned before, he loved Cadillacs. Yeah. But there was a woman there who had brought her car in, and it was, you know, an old beaten up thing. You know, she'd brought it in to be serviced and fixed up. Elvis went over, asked her what car she really liked in the lot. She picked out one. She was like, oh, I'd love that. It'd be my dream car. Maybe someday I'll have it. And he goes, someday is today. It's yours. And he bought her. You know, he was always buying cars. If someone sent him a letter, you know, a fan mail back in those days, someone sent him a letter saying, you know, they were going through some hardship or anything. He'd be like, hey guys, buy her a house or buy her a car, or, you know, he was always helping people. Yeah.
He's a generous kind of guy, all right. But that story with the guy, one of the Memphis Mafia, he was gambling himself one night at maybe a craps table or whatever it is, blackjack table, one night in Las Vegas. And this guy, he was gambling himself anyway, and he was up from like $2,000 up to $150,000. So he was doing fairly well for himself. But here comes along Colonel Parker then, grabs your man's chips and puts it all on one number, let's say, whatever it is. He places all your man's chips, not his chips, but your man's chips, onto a number. And of course, the guy rolls a 7, loses it all. All $150,000 gone. And he turns to Colonel Parker, like, what the hell are you doing? It's like, how much did you start with? Start with 2,000. Here it is. He gave him 2,000. He didn't lose anything, Tom Parker says. And technically he was right, but it's not a cool thing to do.
Sting a bit.
Mag up at 100,000, 150,000. So Elvis is getting loads and loads of hits. He was going strong. Colonel Parker was, I suppose, putting him in the right place at the right time. Started getting him film roles. So he had as I said at the start of the episode, he did 31 films over the course of his career. But some of the films that he went into were Blue Hawaii. There was Viva Las Vegas, which actually I watched there yesterday. Well, I kind of flicked through it at least.
What you think?
It was fun. It was. The reason I picked it was because it was like about a race car driver and all this kind of thing. I was like, oh yeah, I like cars and racing and stuff. So I was like, let's go into it. But then he was racing for like 5 minutes at the end, and it was against like a blue screen or, you know, the green screen thing. But yeah, that he kind of created his own genre movies. They kind of became known as Elvis movies because they were basically kind of a comedy, a romantic comedy with musical numbers, musical interludes.
Yeah, he was. It didn't start like that. His first film was Love Me Tender.
Yeah.
And he was really excited about it. He thought he idolized James Dean and Marlon Brando. and he wanted to be like them. So when he started making movies, it was like, yes, I'm going to be the next biggest actor. I'm going to be just like my heroes.
Yeah.
So, but the Colonel had other ideas. He thought the only way that he'd actually make money and sell the movies to audiences as if Elvis sings. Now, the first few films were fine, you know, they were like other films from the 50s, proper serious, you know, where he'd have to act. Then they got into a habit of basically making the same film over and over. He was either a race car driver who could sing, or a speedboat racer, or a boxer, or, you know,
he was always trying to get the girl.
Exactly.
And the girl didn't want any part of it at the beginning, but then warmed up to him. That kind of idea.
Yeah. There's if I had to pick one from the later movies, that I'd watch again, maybe, because they're all the same. But one that's probably the most fun is called Kissing Cousins, and there's two Elvises in it. So he's like this army guy, and they're going into the bush in Tennessee where there's hillbillies, and he has to convince the hillbillies that live there to let him and the army put a big missile base on their land. But he finds out that they're his cousins, and one of them is actually like his identical twin. So it's basically Elvis, and it's the only time you'll ever see Elvis with his natural hair color, because Elvis wasn't naturally black haired. He was a kind of a sandy, blondie brown haired.
Right. Okay.
So when he's playing the other character in the film, he has sandy brown blonde hair. But it's probably the most enjoyable out of the later films.
Yeah,
so
I didn't heard that one now.
Go check it out.
Yeah. Apparently they were like juggernauts. They were like absolute, box office smashes. And of course, every movie he did, there was, multiple musical interludes, multiple songs in that film. And then those soundtracks kind of became his next album at the time. Even though it wasn't, I suppose, your regular idea of an album, it was just the soundtrack of the film. And there's a lot of songs. So each film would have different sets of songs, but the song kind of suits the scene in the movie. And if you listen to all the songs on an album, they might not kind of sit right, or they might not kind of suit Elvis' style. So he kind of began to become kind of, I suppose, disillusioned with doing it that way. He wasn't making the music that he wanted to. He was kind of told the right song to play for the right scene. And then they were released as his, or kind of officially his record, but they weren't really officially his record, his albums, let's say.
Yeah, exactly. But they were for a good period, they were all he was releasing, because it was movie after movie. He'd make one movie for a couple of months and then a couple of weeks break and then straight on to the next one. Yeah. And they were the only records he was releasing. And he deeply, deeply missed like a live audience, because obviously he was literally just in the recording studio recording the soundtrack. That was it. He wasn't touring, and he really missed that. And it was a mix of the movies getting worse and him not being able to tour to people or actually get any feedback from fans about his music, that led to him being very unhappy. There's stories that it actually started to physically affect his health, that he was getting so frustrated with it.
That eventually leads to, I suppose later on in the line, leads to his dependency on pills. But there was plenty of films that he didn't want to do at all. And I've heard a voice recording of Tom Parker saying, I know if Elvis ever came to me and said he didn't want to do a film, that's fine. We wouldn't do that film. And then the next thing was another guy, one of his Memphis Mafia guys saying, there's this one particular film that Elvis just didn't want to do. He just wants to refuse it. But then Tom Parker came down. The movie guys, the movie studio guys came down, basically told him, if you don't do this, you won't be working again. Yeah. And that was basically the story of most of his career, really. There was a time, again, we get to where he did kind of start to find his feet again, find his inspiration in that. But for many years, he was just told what to sing, what to do, where to stand, what to say. He had no real choice in it. I suppose this is coming up to now 1950, late 1957, 1958. when he was actually drafted into the US Army. But at the time, I suppose, being drafted into the US Army, it wasn't the worst time. It could have been, could have been worse. Could have been Second World War, or
Exactly.
the Korean War had just finished, 1955, I think. So he wasn't going to be sent to any front, thankfully. But apparently, news that Elvis was going to the army. Elvis was a major star at this time, anyway.
Yeah.
And the news that this guy was going to the army was huge. And apparently, there was, the Air Force wanted him. Different parts of the army wanted him as a kind of almost like a mascot, let's say. We'll bring Elvis in now, we'll tour him around to all the troops, and he'll boost morale, this kind of stuff. But Elvis, he basically said, no, let's just do, look, treat me like any other soldier.
Yeah.
I'll come in and I'll just do my
special treatment.
He wanted special treatment. Yeah.
Do it all and experience it properly.
Yeah, that's right. So he was sent to Germany, and I think he was asked, how are the other guys in his group or whatever treating him? And he said, yeah, no, they're all good. They know I'm not here looking for special treatment. They get on. We just get on with what needs to be done. And that, did you see? There's the media coverage of it was crazy at the time.
Yeah,
there was never so much people at a, what you call it, a signing office or a draft office. What you call
draft
it?
Office, yeah.
And then
it's crazy. And the footage, you can see him. There's everything from them putting his name on the bag to him getting his hair cut and getting sized up for his uniform. It's mental.
He had his iconic haircut at the time, his side locks and this jet black hair, but then he had to get it all shaved off, crew cut. Yeah, exactly.
He was beforehand though. It's I know the media had said that it was great and he was really looking forward to it and all, but behind closed doors, he was actually very worried about it. He thought his career was over. The Colonel had him in the studio for months leading up to it, so he'd have enough tracks to continuously release records while he was in the army.
Yeah,
to keep his name in people's minds. But there was a change coming as well. Like Buddy Holly had died. There was lots of new types of singers coming up, and Elvis thought, if I go away now for 3 or 4 years, there's going to be nothing when I come back. So he was deeply worried. And the army he enjoyed it, but it was also a dark period for him as well, as I'm sure we'll get into.
As we were saying with the music soundtracks or the movie soundtracks, the songs he was putting out there weren't really the songs that he wanted. He wasn't developing his sound as a musician. And he wasn't in touch with what was going on in rock and roll at the time. Basically, the genre that he created, pretty much, it was kind of, again, the life of his own, and without him, and it kind of went off in its own directions. Like you had the Beatles and so on, and he was kind of out of the loop. Let's say he was in his bubble doing the movie songs and that. And I suppose before this as well, he had this kind of reputation as being, the rock and roll had a reputation of being like the devil's music. It was full of sex and horrible, terrible stuff, corrupting the youth of America, this kind of thing. And he was on the Ed Sullivan Show. This is a fairly famous one. I think it was just before he went to the army, and they had to frame him from basically the waist up because he was very known for his pelvis. Elvis the pelvis, they call him. He was shaking his pelvis, and apparently that was the height of ludicrous carry on. And so on the Ed Sullivan Show, he's framed from the waist up, but everyone kind of knew what was going on underneath the frame, let's say. And it's just funny the way it's, if some of those people back then, if they had seen something like, Cardi B today or something like that, they'd probably die right on the spot, I'd say.
That's what I'm always thinking. Like, it's weird to think that Elvis Presley was banned when he came out first, and there was actually people protesting against his music being played, or if he was making an appearance places in the South.
Right.
There'd be protests there, a lot of angry parents and everything saying that he was no good for the youth and everything. And all he was doing was literally like shaking his legs when he was on stage and dancing around. I suppose they were so used to singers like Frank Sinatra just standing still in front of the mic,
Yeah.
But he was
good,
getting passionate
singers.
about it. Yeah.
Yeah, he was getting blamed for teenage hooliganism and juvenile delinquency. But I suppose it was kind of the antithesis when he was on, say, he was being interviewed. He was very kind of affable and he was very polite, soft-spoken. And as you said earlier, he's shy. So, when he's off stage, he's very shy. But when he's on stage, he's like Elvis Pelvis. He went for it. He didn't hold back. But yeah, he's off stage for someone that kind of basically went against that whole reputation of being, a troublemaker.
Yeah, he was very, some people would have called him moody and, quiet and very introspective.
Yeah. So, in the 1960s, then he returned from the army. But you were saying things went a bit dark in the army. Is that what you were saying, or is it after the army?
Yeah. During his time in the army, he had, that was his first time getting properly into drugs, and it stayed with him. They used to, I think the term they used for him was bennies.
Bennies.
That's what they used to call
Benadryl
pills.
Or something, is it? Or is that?
Probably, yeah. Maybe, it was uppers. It was basically like speed. They'd be sent out on drills and they'd have to stay awake for the whole night, and obviously that's hard to do. So all the soldiers would start taking uppers and stuff like speed to stay awake, but they were always prescription, and he viewed prescription drugs as not drugs.
Yeah, because that's the thing back in the day. Yeah, every single thing he took was prescribed. There's nothing illegal, nothing like that. And of course, the ideas of what opiates can do back then, or at least they didn't have any ideas of the side effects, long-term side effects. They had none of that. They were just freely prescribing them.
Yeah, exactly.
Uppers and downers and sleeping pills and whatever over the course of the next few years.
It's mad to think of it, And then, of course, the perception that it came from a doctor always stuck with him. So he always thought, if it comes from a doctor, it's fine, it can't harm you.
Yeah.
But probably the worst time in his life came during the army, and possibly the best time in his life. It was kind of a double-edged sword. He met Priscilla while he was in Germany. And of course, his mother passed away, which was totally devastating for him. As we've mentioned earlier, how close they were, it must have felt like a massive part of him was gone,
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. He, she died when he was still in Germany. And I think later on, Priscilla said that when I think she visited Graceland for the first time, she found a closet full of Elvis's or Gladys's clothes, her shoes, her belongings, stuff like that. And he could even get her smell, her scent on the clothes. So he had this real deep connection to her.
Yeah, it was almost like a shrine.
Yeah. As you said, though, he did meet Priscilla. And she was, I think, only a teenager at the time. She was still in high school. She
was 14, I think.
That's true,
He was 25.
Yeah, it's a little questionable. Dodgy. Yeah, a little dodgy. But eventually, she did move back to America with Elvis. And they actually got married in, I think it was 1967. I think he waited until she was out of high school at least.
That's
yikes.
as legendary as he is, that's something that I don't know, you can't get past. Like
people don't talk about that part so much.
No, they don't. But after the army, he went back to the States and back to Graceland and kept sending her letters. And there's a famous thing of it's a little audio clip of him. It was like, when I got back, they kept asking, was there anyone special? And I have to say no. And
that's true,
of course, they got pictures of her at the airport, and they kept saying the girl he left behind, but he said no, there was no one special. But he kept writing her parents then and asking, could she come and live in Graceland? And that his grandmother, who lived in like a little granny flat on the grounds of Graceland, that she could live there, and his grandmother would take care of him, and he'd make sure she goes to school, and there'd be nothing romantic until she was 17 or 18. But I don't think it lasted more than a week that she was living with the grandmother. It's very, very odd. But there's a couple of singers back then that
Jimmy Page was one.
Jerry Lee Lewis as well.
That was his Jerry Lee Lewis married his cousin.
Yeah, and I think
Something
she
like
was like 12 or 13.
Something like that. Yeah.
That's,
There
it's
was
weird.
it's a very strange habit of these guys
Yeah.
doing that kind of thing. But
Yeah.
I suppose we've mentioned Graceland. We didn't go into it before, but Graceland, of course, was Elvis's mansion that he has in Memphis, Tennessee. Apparently, it's 13.8 acres inside, and I think he bought it for something like $104,000 in I think the 1950s, something like that. And of course, that's where he lived anytime he wasn't on tour. And now it's it's a tourist attraction. You have
a museum,
thousands of people coming from all around the world. And you hear stories of people like, say, this one woman in Australia, she goes twice a year, every year for the last 16 years or something like that.
Yeah, it's mental. I think it's like either the number 1 or number 2 most visited places in America. It's a protected building now as well, of course.
Right,
Protected historical building.
Yeah. And of course, it has
cool
the...
What?
So, it has the iconic gates out the front as well. With the music notation on it and the Elvis playing the guitar. And he's buried there as well, isn't he?
He is out in the garden.
Yeah, so on big anniversaries of his death, let's say, you could have tens and tens of thousands of people, of tourists coming, of Elvis fans coming from all around the world to come see him. Which is it says here you could have had 650,000 visitors a year. And obviously that was before pandemic times. But I'd say it's creeping back up again, to be honest with you.
I'd say so. But it's like Disneyland for Elvis fans, really. There's so much there, and pardon me, there's so much there, and you can go see his planes, his cars, his suit. There's a big massive building across the road now. It's like a big warehouse where it houses everything he owned, and there's I think there's like a super VIP ticket you can buy where it'll bring you through in small groups. You have to put on these gloves, but it'll actually let you hold his jewelry and his car keys, stuff like that. But
it's mad. Yeah,
it is. But it's kind of cool that it's there as well for Elvis fans.
That's it. And I suppose then when getting back to the timeline, he did come back from the army. He was straight back into the movies again. Colonel Parker had him straight back in. As you said, while he was in the army, he had a stockpile of songs lined up and ready to release every few months or every few weeks or whatever it was, kind of keep his name out there, kind of keep in the minds of fans. But then, he'd be straight into the movies. You had Change of Blue Hawaii, Change of Habit, Viva Las Vegas, all these films. You could go on and on, list them all out, but we'd be here all day. But he had very famous songs from these films. Like, as I said, the soundtracks were being released. So you had like Viva Las Vegas and all these kind of songs that were kind of standout. And even Priscilla Presley she says, not all of them are bad. You did have the good ones now and again.
Yeah.
But that's obviously not where he wanted to be as a singer. So, and again, this is a period of time from before the army to up to 1968. He hadn't toured at all. He hadn't played a gig in like 10 years, something like that.
Yeah.
And I think the last gig he did was for like a charity gig for the army, somewhere around 1958, give or take. I think that was the last gig he actually did in front of people.
Yeah.
But the first big gig he had in that 10 years was the 1968 special. Are you very familiar with this particular special?
I am, the comeback special.
Yeah.
That was massive, and such iconic as well imagery with it. You can see him on the little stage surrounded by people and in the leather suit with the Gibson. Is it a 355 or something?
I think guitar. It's a 355, yeah.
And,
it's a big semi-hollow body acoustic electric guitar.
And he's sitting there with the original guys from the 50s, Scotty Moore and Bill Black. And, there's a
small crowd as well. There was about less than 100 anyway. It was like maybe 60, 70, and they're all kind of a select group of kind of invitees.
Yeah. Yeah, and they're all very close to him. Like they're only about a foot away from him.
Yeah.
And
so if you picture, he had this square stage in the center with Elvis and the band, and then the audience was kind of around him. And apparently, before he went on, he brought in one of the guys in the band, and he told everyone else to leave the room because he wants to talk to the guy from the band. And he goes to him, "Look, I don't want to do this. I want to call this off. Like I've been practicing the songs earlier on, but I can't remember what songs are. I can't remember the stories I'm going to tell between the songs. My mind's a blank. I can't do this." But his friend goes, "Look, I'm not going to tell you what to do, but I think you should do this. I'm not telling you this to make money or anything. This, he's like, just for your own sake, I think it's wise to go and do this."
Yeah.
Yeah. So Elvis did go out, and I saw the first few minutes when he went out, and he stood on the stage. He looked around like people, they kind of like me. He's always afraid of how people would react because he'd been away for so long, and he was so like deathly nervous.
Yeah.
And he went up and he picked up his guitar and he sat down. He just started strumming this rock and roll song, this 12-bar blues kind of a song. And even for the first few minutes, he didn't sing. He's just jamming. He's just doing a few guitar licks. He was getting the feel for it. He was just kind of, the guys were playing along with him, kind of following what he was doing. And he was leading the band, let's say, but you can tell, you could see him kind of click and go, yeah, I'm enjoying this. Because he was away for so long.
Yeah, exactly. Must have been some feeling though to, realizing people still love you and still want them to perform like.
Yeah.
And then you could see him gradually getting more and more relaxed, as you said. And I think before he launched into his first song, there's a bit where they start playing the first few notes and he stops and he goes, "No, wait. I forgot my lip thing. Didn't I used to curl my lip?" And, I'd start laughing, but it was, it was cool that he'd stop and tell stories and jokes and,
Yeah.
It would have been epic to be one of the people in the crowd for that, because that's peak Elvis. Doesn't get better than that. It's not new, young 1950s Elvis. It's not old Las Vegas, washed out Elvis. It's 68 comeback. Elvis is in his prime. He's the fittest that he's ever been in his life. Looking great, sounding great. That's when you want to see Elvis.
Yeah, it was around this time that I suppose Tom Parker was still his manager, but I don't think he had as much of a grasp on him at this time. Kind of Elvis started like writing new songs himself, taking old influences from gospel, and I think he released a gospel album at this time as well. And he loved doing it, and you could tell in his voice that he loved performing it as well. And then he went on to release Suspicious Minds in 1969, which was like one of the only singles that he had released in a long time that wasn't connected to a movie that he did. And it was straight up to number one. And of course, Suspicious Minds is still, it came out there again. Remember a few years ago, it became huge again. Songs like Bossa Nova and all these songs kind of, there was remixes, a little less conversation, more sad.
There's not many people that like 40 years after their death are still getting number ones, know?
That was probably 10 plus years ago when that happened now, but everything seems like so, it doesn't seem so long ago. But there was a big rejuvenation of Elvis songs there in the last 10, 15 years. And I suppose now that I think of it, the whole film, Lilo and Stitch, the Disney film.
Yeah, actually.
That was based, like all the songs were Elvis songs in that. And
it was
the little alien was a fan. He dressed up in the leather suit and all this kind of stuff.
It's kind of a cool way of introducing a very younger audience into Elvis's music.
That's true. Yeah, that's it. But he was, after he released Suspicious Mind, he basically kind of found his stride again. This was like, as you said, his like peak Elvis. So he had married Lisa Marie in 1967.
Priscilla.
Sorry, I'm getting mixed up. Priscilla. And then his daughter, Lisa Marie, was born in 1968. But himself and Priscilla ended up getting divorced in 1973 because Elvis was out on the road all the time. He wasn't basically connected to her, I suppose, in any way. She couldn't go out on the road with him because she had to look after the kid.
Yeah.
And I suppose they drifted apart. But apparently she was saying that they were still holding hands in divorce court. There was still great affection between the two. They just couldn't make it work, I suppose, long term.
Yeah, the thing was he couldn't seem to understand that, he had to be faithful when he was out on the road, and he'd got very used to, the rock star life, being out on the road, and he'd be, he might be only home for 1 month a year, and he'd be touring the whole time, and, many, many women every night. But, and he felt like she should be fine with that. But it was when she ended up having an affair, and I know die-hard Elvis fans would be like, oh, that terrible woman.
Yeah.
I'm sure they'd say worse things, but you couldn't really blame her. He brought her over when she was 14. All she knew growing through her teenage years and her 20s was living at Graceland, and she couldn't, it's not like she could go out and, enjoy a meal at a restaurant with her husband because it'd be mobbed. She didn't have a normal life at all. So he's off then to have a baby, and she's left at home being a mother, minding the child, and he's off having the time of his life around America. So she ended up having an affair, and that's when Elvis got really, really, mad.
Yeah.
He didn't like it one bit. He felt like he should be able to do it, but she can't. She's a wife for places in the house, in the home, looking after the family. She shouldn't even have those thoughts at all. She should just be devoted to him. But as you mentioned, they stayed the best of friends, and apparently they never stopped loving each other. There's I think you're referring to the famous photograph of them leaving divorce court, and they're holding hands and smiling, which is unusual to see. But yeah, they were very amicable to each other, and the best of friends even afterwards, and still in each other's lives.
That's it, yeah.
But I think it was Chuck Norris, or she had had an affair with Chuck Norris.
Oh yeah.
But it was I think her karate teacher that Elvis had hired to teach her karate. He's the guy that she had an affair with that led to them breaking up. But Elvis wanted to hire a hitman, and he gave the guys in the Memphis Mafia the order to go out and hire a hitman. And they thought to themselves, we're going to wait until he calms down, because I'm sure he doesn't want to really do this. So for a while they were like, we'll do it. We're in the middle of sorting that out. Then a couple of weeks later, he was like, you know what, guys, I think I'll leave it. I don't think I want to do that. So luckily they didn't rush out and, hire a hitman to go and kill the guy.
Wow.
Things would have been very different. Yeah,
I did a bit of research on this, and I didn't come across that at all.
Really?
None of her affair, none of the talk about hitman, none of that. So that's news to me. Oh. So I suppose a lot of that stuff is kind of hidden, I guess you could say.
Yeah, that's the thing, especially nowadays. I suppose Elvis is glorified more and more, and you have to really deep dive for any of the darker stuff or any of the
stuff,
bad stuff. I mean, there's fans out there that, it'd be blasphemy if you said one bad thing about Elvis,
It's true, yeah. Hopefully there's no diehard Elvis fans listening to this now and furiously typing in some emails.
I can imagine all the emails you'll get. But did you know there's actually a Church of Elvis?
No, I did not. What's this?
Yeah.
There is.
In America. In America somewhere, there's actually a registered religion where they worship Elvis.
Wow.
I think it's called the Church of Elvis. It's a bit mad.
Please tell me that the priest or whoever's given the sermon is dressed as Elvis. It has to be.
Oh yeah, I'd say he is.
Oh, that's amazing. Of course, in Las Vegas, you can get married by an Elvis impersonator, so that's a huge thing up there as well.
Yeah. It is. There's nearly every second chapel, I believe, is an Elvis chapel, and they have a guy dressed as Elvis who will marry you.
Yeah.
It's been an experience, but I think it's a bit cheesy.
I think so too, yeah. Make a good Instagram photo, but that's about it, I'd say.
Exactly,
yeah. So it was during this 1973 that they got divorced. And of course, this was because of the the huge touring schedule that Tom Parker had Elvis on. And it kind of came to the stage where Elvis wanted to start touring outside of America, wants to go to Europe, go to Japan, back to Germany, wherever. Because there was, obviously, he did have an audience out there. People were clamoring for him to go. But, of course, we mentioned earlier that Tom Parker didn't want to do that in case he didn't, for one thing, he didn't want to let Elvis go on his own. Yeah. Or he didn't want someone else to look after Elvis while he was over there because he wouldn't have full control and he might end up losing Elvis or whatever it is. So basically, he didn't want to tell Elvis exactly why he didn't want to go anywhere. A, because he could get arrested if he goes back to Holland, or B, he might not get back into America because he was an illegal immigrant. But he kind of, bet around the bush, I suppose, and kind of didn't give Elvis a real clear, this is why we're not going to Europe or anything like this. But what he did do in, was it 1973, he decided to get around this conundrum where Elvis wants to leave the country. Tom Parker decided to put on a satellite show. So are you familiar with this? This is Aloha from Hawaii via satellite.
I am, yeah. It was a great idea by the Colonel to, to quieten Elvis for a while, to stop the nagging about leaving the country.
Yeah.
Because technically he had to get on a plane and cross an ocean to get there.
Yeah.
But it was the first globally televised satellite event. I think it had the highest figures of people tuning in as well.
It was a global event. It was huge. There was loads of media coverage around it. Basically, it was a gig performed in Aloha that was being satellite, what would you say? Streamed, as you say nowadays, broadcast around the world to potentially millions and millions, if not billions, potentially. And Elvis, obviously, he was deathly terrified as well about this. He was so nervous. There's another thing about him. He was incredibly nervous about all this stuff because even going back to the 68 special where he was just performing in front of just a few people, then all of a sudden, I think his next gig after that, like a few weeks later or whatever, was in Las Vegas where he was in front of thousands, let's say. And he was like an absolute nervous wreck the whole time. But you wouldn't tell. As soon as he got on stage, it was just, once he found his flow, he was away.
Yeah.
You wouldn't tell.
The personality came out.
And some people were saying that the person that he was on stage was Elvis. And then he had to kind of act, when he was off the stage, act this kind of shy person. But when he went on stage, that was real Elvis. Whereas a lot of musicians, the other way around, it's kind of, they're just a normal person, then they go on stage and then they become a new character or whatever.
Yeah, it's an odd one, all right. But he would suffer awful with his nerves, as you were saying. For years, he'd have a lot of stomach problems when he'd get nervous, and then of course the eating wouldn't, and the stuff he ate wouldn't help, But
and this show, this Aloha from Hawaii, this was just after his 59 show engagement in Las Vegas. So this was Colonel Tom Parker in his most controlling state, was getting Elvis to perform 2 concerts a day, possibly 7 days a week, if not 6 days a week, in Las Vegas as residency, as you call it, as it's called nowadays, Las Vegas residency. But 59 shows in 30 days.
It's madness, isn't it?
And being a musician, if getting up and playing for an hour or two, you're pretty much drained from that, and then you don't want to have to go and do it again, and then the next day twice again. It's just it's
you wonder how you could keep it up, really. And obviously he didn't, and as we'll hear. But even for that amount of years, how you could keep it up, practically working every day, and he wasn't, as we mentioned before, he wasn't the type of person to stand still on stage.
No.
When he was in Vegas, he started adding karate. He was obsessed with karate. So started adding karate moves into his stage act, and if you watch him, he's sweating buckets and he's moving all over the stage. He uses the full stage, doing that twice a day, in the afternoon, then in the evening. that is going to kill you eventually.
Yeah. And it was said that as well, these people that were coming to these Las Vegas gigs, these were people that had money, let's say. They weren't the general public. They weren't the people that Elvis necessarily wanted to play to, because at the front of the stage, you have dinner tables. And those dinner tables, in order to get one of those tables, you had to lay down a lot of money for your ticket. So these were kind of high rollers, kind of older people that wouldn't, I don't know, they probably just wanted to be there to be seen to be there and not necessarily listen to Elvis.
So wouldn't appreciate him.
Wouldn't appreciate. So and Elvis is here playing to these people and he didn't get anything back off them.
Yeah.
So that's the thing, when you're playing live, you do love getting a response from the crowd. You know, they cheer what you're doing and they let you know what you're doing is right and they give you an energy and, you know, you make them excited, they make you excited and it kind of builds the energy and basically makes a good show. But he didn't find that. He
really missed the fans from years ago, you know, the younger teenagers and younger people who'd be screaming and getting so excited, you know. Like you must know yourself when you're performing. If you were performing to a lot of people eating their dinner and, you know, maybe just glancing up at you every now and again, how would that make you feel, you know?
It's horrible. There was one time I performed to a group of accountants and actuaries.
Right.
It was kind of... it was a slow gig.
They sound like a fun bunch, all right.
Less about that we say the better, I suppose. But so he did the Aloha from
Hawaii.
Aloha from Hawaii, yes. Yeah, head's going now at this stage. And then after this, then he did start doing tours around America. It wasn't just stuck in Las Vegas. So he was eventually getting out to Texas and different places and kind of perform in front of the general public and not just these kind of fat cats that were smoking cigars in the front row, let's say. So he did start getting out there. But the thing is, when he was in Las Vegas, his whole day-to-day routine was get out of bed, do the show, go back to bed, get out of bed again, do the second show, go back to bed again. So he's pretty much in his bed, to the stage, and back to his bed. He didn't leave the hotel for the whole month, let's say. And basically had him and his Memphis Mafia were hanging around him. So his, 7 to 15 guys, let's say, at any given time. And so it's him in his hotel room, in his bed, to the stage and back, and just hanging out with the same few people day in, day out. There were times, there was one story from one of the Memphis Mafia's guys, that they came into the hotel room. There was the 7 of those, and Elvis as well. And there was 150 women in the hotel room. Obviously it's not a regular hotel room. It would have been a presidential suite or whatever it is. So it's just 7 of those guys and 150 women. And that was a kind of a regular thing. And as you said, that didn't bode well with his married status.
No, you wouldn't think so.
Yeah.
You know, it's something only Elvis could do, I'm sure, though.
Yes.
But even, go on.
No, go on.
Oh, I was going to say we'll probably touch on it later, but even when he was back in Vegas or back in Gracelands, you know, after the divorce, he used to have massive parties with people like that, like the fans are. He was known to actually, there'd always be girls lined up at the gate waiting. They were called the gate girls. They'd be waiting at the gate for when he'd drive in or drive out, and he'd always stop and, you know, sign stuff for him. He was always very good to the fans. He'd give them time, you know.
Yeah.
But he was known for actually inviting them up to the house, you know, and they actually became friendly with him, and he knew them on a first name basis. There was like groups of them. He had a house out in California as well.
Yeah.
And these 2 separate groups would actually get to meet each other, and they became friends then, and it was like they had a network between each other, and they'd contact each other and be like, oh yeah, Elvis is out here, there's no point queuing up at Graceland, or vice versa. But for Christmas and everything, he'd actually hire out the local nightclub and throw a party for all the girls at the gate and everything, and he'd go down. But it's a weird life, you know, having that many people around you and being able to throw parties like that. And you know, a lot of these parties, as you mentioned, would have been 14, 15 men, including Elvis, and 100, 150 women.
Yeah.
So, yeah. I suppose the less said, the better.
So, and once you get used to that kind of lifestyle, it's hard to do anything else, you know?
Yeah, it'd be hard to walk away from it. And even the guys in the Memphis Mafia, like, they were married as well. They all got married around the same time as Elvis. You know, they were the same age as him. They were getting to the age where you'd be getting married, settling down, and they'd have to deal with, like, Elvis wanting to party and wanting to, you know, live the single life while they had their partners, you know, and a lot of them would have lived maybe on the grounds of Graceland with their wife or very close to them just down the street, you know. And Absolutely. he wanted to constantly be doing stuff with the guys, you know. If he was bored, the guys had to be there ready to, you know, whether it's go off racing cars, driving motorbikes. They you'd wonder how their wives put up with it. And I know a lot of them ended up getting divorced as well. But you're basically at Elvis's beck and call. But there was a thing, I remember hearing the guy saying as well, if he was in a bad mood, you had to be in a bad mood. But if he was in a good mood, you had to be in a good mood. You know, and it was the same with, you know, with drugs as well. If he was taking 7 of these pills, you had to take 7. And he wouldn't let you not do it, you know? Yeah. Which was tough on the guys as well, I'm sure.
Yeah. I remember hearing some of the guys from Memphis Mafia talking about that and how, I suppose when he became dependent on sleeping pills and the uppers and the downers, his mood, especially after he got divorced, his mood was up and down. Bottom. Yeah, rock bottom a lot of the time. He'd fairly get angry a lot. He just wasn't himself, especially after getting divorced. That kind of shook him, I suppose. It wasn't what he wanted in life. He's very family-oriented kind of guy. So he became a very moody character, you could say. And then the drugs would have, you know, exacerbated the moods as well. So when he's happy, he's really happy. And when he's down, he'd be terribly really down.
Yeah. But as I was saying earlier on, he didn't think he had a problem and he didn't think he was doing anything wrong because he got them off a doctor.
Yeah.
But his personal doctor was called Dr. Nick, and he'd bring him up in the middle of the night and he'd send over an envelope, and, you know, there could be like 100 pills in it. And he'd be taking 50, 60 pills a day, you know, pills crazy. To go sleep, to wake up, for everything. Yeah. You know, it's crazy. You'd wonder how he lasted so long.
Yeah. And was it a case that his doctor was, I suppose he was charged with neglect or, you know, malpractice, you could say, after Elvis' death, but he did get away with it, whatever happened. I suppose I can compare it to Michael Jackson's doctor, same kind of situation.
Very similar.
Very similar. And of course, did Michael Jackson actually marry Elvis' daughter, Lisa Marie?
He did. So, it's
kind of two world icons, music icons in their separate eras. They're very connected.
Yeah, the king of pop and the king of rock.
Yeah, that's it. And then two of them kind of went out I suppose a similar enough way now you think of it.
They were very similar actually, and both kind of young. You know, I think
they're Michael Jackson was about 50 or something, wasn't he? And then
I think he wasn't he?
Something around that, yeah. Of course, Elvis was only 42 when he died, which is madness. But I suppose we're getting to that there now. This is kind of coming into the last few years of his life where his incredible touring, I suppose, schedule was just absolutely bonkers. He never had he'd have like maybe a week off or 2 weeks off here and there, and he'd go back to Graceland. And I think one of the final albums that he recorded, he didn't even want to go to the studio anymore. He was very disillusioned with the whole thing. He wasn't in love with the music anymore. It was just something I had to do in order to make more money, in order to keep this whole machine.
Start feeling like a job.
Run. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So he basically said to him, look, if you want me to record an album, you bring the album to me. So he he did it in Graceland. They got a recording truck outside. They snaked all the wires from the truck into the house, and they set up in the jungle room, as they call it, him and the band. And they basically recorded one of his final albums. I think it was the there was some gospel in it as well. Now I haven't got the name in front of me here now, but that was like the last recording that he did was in Graceland because he just didn't want to go to a studio anymore.
Yeah.
As I said as well, he recorded something like 784 songs in total over his career. And that's a long, long time in the studio.
Yeah.
But I love being in the studio myself, but it comes a time when that's a bit too much, you know.
Yeah, I'd imagine. And as you said, he was 42, you know, it's not like he was 62 or 72 and he was after recording 700 and something songs.
Yeah.
You know, that's a lot in such a short period of time.
Such a short time. So basically coming to the end of his life, I suppose you could say, he was starting to gain weight, which was, you know, a cardinal sin in Hollywood, in anywhere like that, in the music business or whatever. And of course, at this time, he was wearing his iconic jumpsuits from when he started his Las Vegas residency, when he started wearing these like big white jeweled jumpsuits with the wings under his arms. When he went out like this, he looked like a big bird. He had capes on. He had all this kind of thing. But yeah, the lifestyle kind of started grinding on him. He started getting overweight. He couldn't sleep, so he's taking a ton of sleep pills. He's taking uppers, downers. He started very bad diets as well. He had terrible diets. Really greasy, deep fried foods. And when he finds something he liked, like sauerkraut and potatoes, that's all he would eat for weeks on end. And then he gets sick of it and then go on to something else. And of course, there was that very famous dish he had. Do you know what that is now, off the top of your head?
There's a couple. There's a couple. His, you talking about the sandwich?
The sandwich.
Fried peanut butter banana sandwich.
Yeah, and it was pretty much a loaf of bread, wasn't it? A loaf of bread cut in half with, what did you say, banana and...
Peanut butter, banana, and sometimes there'd be jello or jelly on it.
Yeah. And then he deep fried the whole thing.
Yeah. So you covered in batter and deep fry it. I've actually had it myself and it's quite nice, but I could only eat one half of a normal sized sandwich of it. It's really filling. But like he was eating, as you said, a whole loaf.
A whole loaf. That's probably 5,000-6,000 calories at least. Which and your normal daily, you know, recommendations, what, like 2,500 for a man anyway, 2,500 calories a day. He was eating probably twice that in one meal.
Yeah, exactly.
And it was really greasy, deep fried, terrible stuff on his system. And I think it had a knock-on effect on his health and his toilet ventures, you could say.
That was like another addiction as well. Eating, you know, he'd his personal maid was there in the house 24 hours and she'd normally get a call. It could be 2-3 o'clock in the morning. He'd be wanting like cheeseburgers or, you know, one of them sandwiches. There's actually a story that he was in Graceland and he got a craving for a burger he used to get out in California. He sent his personal jet to pick up like 100 of them burgers and fly them back to Memphis.
That's amazing, yeah.
You know?
Yeah. And it was that over exuberant lifestyle and all the prescription drugs, all that stuff basically led to him on his last day. He went to the toilet. He was sitting on the toilet and he died of a heart attack. And he was found on the floor, lifeless pretty much. And that was in 77. That was summer of 77. This is actually, he was back on a break from touring. So this is like in between two tours. He just went back to Graceland for a few weeks and ended up dying on the toilet.
They'd said that the week coming up to it, he in the week coming up to it, that his mood hadn't been great. And the last day he'd had a couple of friends and his new girlfriend, Ginger.
Ginger, yeah.
Yeah, Ginger Alden, I think.
Yeah.
Were there and a couple of the guys and they'd been out playing racquetball. And Elvis hit himself in the shin because obviously the weight, he wasn't as nimble on the court as he once was. And he used to have an awful temper if he couldn't do something. So he ended up hitting himself in the shin and got very annoyed and said, that's it, let's go inside. So I think they were up until like 3 or 4 in the morning, could have been. And he was sitting around the piano and he was playing gospel songs and singing. Then he went to bed and she fell asleep straight away. And the last thing she heard him say was, "I'm going to the toilet to read." He used to love apparently sitting on the toilet reading, and he had his toilet adapted to be very comfortable.
Yeah.
So it was more like sitting on a couch than an actual toilet, and he could spend hours in there. Yeah, exactly, exactly. But a lot of people say, you know, he died because he was so fat and stuff like that. But there's photos
potentially
of him
backed up and all this kind of stuff.
Yeah, there's photos of
food
him.
And that essentially.
There's photos of him looking very, very fat around the time he died. But there was there's a couple of sources that say it was, you know, one day he'd look like he was maybe 20 or 30 stone. Then the next day he could look like he was, you know, 15 stone. As you said, it was because he was backed up. He had an elongated intestine and a lot of issues with his intestine.
Yeah.
And his stomach couldn't process food properly. And he was obviously eating the wrong type of food if you have any sort of stomach issues.
Yeah, definitely.
So he mightn't be able to have a movement for weeks at a time. And then it'd happen where he'd need to have a movement, but he'd need to have it there and then, you know, he'd almost need to be on the toilet. He couldn't stop it. And one of his greatest fears was about pooing himself on stage, to put it nicely. And I think it might have actually happened one night when he done a karate kick. Whoa. He kind of stained the pants a bit, and it really embarrassed him. Yeah. There was one thing that they could have done to solve it, and he refused to do it. They would have given him a colostomy bag. And his exact words was, "I'm Elvis Presley. I'm not walking out on stage with a colostomy bag hanging out of my jumpsuit." Yeah. So no. So he kept on going, and the issues got worse and worse. And the more pain he'd be in, the more painkillers he'd take.
That's true.
Which weren't great.
Yeah.
You know, and
more comfort food he'd eat then as well. And
Exactly.
Yeah. Jeez, this is the stuff that you don't hear the stuff in the documentaries. Anyway.
Yeah. Not most of them anyway.
No.
But
even this reminds me of I suppose before he died, when he was on tour, going back to Tom Parker again now, there was a time when I think Elvis was in bed. They couldn't really wake him up or something like this. He was due to go on stage very shortly. They couldn't really wake him up or anything like that, but Tom Parker got wind of it. He came to the door, knocked on the hotel door, which he actually never visited, apparently. Him and Elvis were they're separate, like, you know, he'd see him on Showtime or whatever, but he never made, you know,
never mingled
socialized
together.
Yeah, never socialized. So it was strange to get Tom Parker turn up at the hotel door, and one of the Memphis Mafia guys opened the door and said, "Hey, he's in the bed there. We'll get him in a minute." And Tom just goes to him, "Nothing matters more than getting Elvis on stage tonight and having him perform. Nothing matters more." So he went in, apparently, into the room, lifted up his head, started smacking his face, dipped his head in water, all this kind of stuff in order to wake him up and get him on the stage. And that's the kind of thing that basically led to all the pill taking and all this stuff and all his eventual death, all that lifestyle. Just
exactly. I'd heard a similar story to that. Could be the same one or maybe a different one, but it was that he almost had OD'd. And the Memphis Mafia couldn't wake him, and he was going blue in the face and, you know, vomiting. And they panicked. They called the doctor and Colonel Parker, and that's why he came to the room, and the doctor was in there.
Okay, maybe we were hearing different versions of the same story.
Could be. But he went in there and slapped them around and everything, and he came back and he goes, "I don't care what happens to that man as long as he's on stage tonight. That's the most important thing."
That's it. Yeah.
And that's really telling about how he felt towards Elvis, you know, and what Elvis had to deal with, you know.
I think he was actually brought up on charges as well for, I suppose, what would you say, endangering his life? Maybe not that far, but he was brought up on charges about how he treated Elvis. But again, he was let go. Nothing never stuck. He was always of the mindset that, Elvis, he could have just told me he wanted to stop at any time. No problem. If there was a song he didn't want to do or a film he didn't want to do, that's no problem. He didn't have to do it. But the truth of the matter was very opposite. He always says, if you don't do this, you're not doing anything else.
exactly. They kind of had like a father-son relationship. It was almost like Elvis was afraid to say no to him. You know, whatever he said, Elvis just shut up and done. You know?
Because Tom Parker was all about the business side of it. He was always about getting the next thing, moving on to the, making that connection, getting onto the next stage, getting onto the bigger stage, that'll get more exposure to get onto the bigger stage and all this kind of thing. Whereas Elvis just wanting to just kind of connect with fans and make music, and the general kind of musician story, pretty much, isn't it? Yeah,
exactly. It wasn't about being the superstar. It was about the music and the fans.
Again, he had to make so much money because Tom Parker was getting 50% of it, and he was gambling it away. So he kept needing more money. So he kept getting Elvis to go out on more tours. And
he was like a cash cow for him.
Yeah, he drove him into the ground completely.
Even Elvis, though, Elvis was nearly broke when he died as well. He only had, I know it's, for us it's a lot, but for Elvis, when you think about the money he made during his lifetime, he only had $1 million left in the bank.
Oh, yeah.
You know?
He would have made like hundreds of millions, if Tom Parker didn't take half of it. And even if he wasn't driven into the ground and died at 42, he could have obviously gone on for many, many more years. And maybe,
Well, you'd imagine so anyway. He could.
Yeah.
I don't think if he hadn't died then and he had lived, I don't think he'd still be alive now with all the health issues he had.
He's still, I suppose. Yeah, that's true. That's true. But after his death, there was mourners from around the world gathered at Graceland, his home, of course. And again, as we said, to this day, they still go amazing.
Yeah.
Thousands of people, hundreds of thousands of people a year go from all over the world. And of course, people that didn't see him, that say people that lived in Europe or Australia or wherever didn't get to see him tour, they made the journey over to Graceland after he died to see his grave. But then, about the whole, I suppose, conspiracy that Elvis didn't actually die and he's still alive. Yeah. And there was reports for years and years that, I saw Elvis, he was down the supermarket and all that kind of stuff.
He was in Home Alone. Have you heard that one?
No.
Yeah. I think it's Home Alone 1. And whichever one of them is anyway, I think it's not, I'm nearly sure it's number 1. The mother is standing at the airport ticket office.
I remember.
And there's a man standing behind her in a brown coat. And he makes apparently the same facial expression Elvis used to make. He has a beard and hair brushed back, but it's all brown. Yeah. Now, I'll admit, he does have a slight resemblance to Elvis. But for, like, even today, people say, he changed his name and they can't find that cast member anywhere and there's no record of him and all that. So to say that Elvis appeared as an extra in Home Alone.
Yeah.
Which, like, if you would fake your death and you're trying to lie low, you're not going to appear in a film.
No, especially not the like of Elvis. You'd be so recognized, like, immediately.
Yeah.
Before you even step into the bit, before you get out of your car, pretty much, someone will see you,
Yeah, exactly.
So, there's a lot of those kind of, like Paul McCartney from the Beatles, there was a whole thing about him. They said that he did die and that he was replaced and all this. There's lots of these, it's always these kind of conspiracy theories in this way. But the Elvis one was a big one that was kind of perpetrated, or, it went on for many years, people saying this and it's always those kind of
today.
Yeah, it was always those kind of those magazines that they used to have, those kind of alien magazines and
the National Enquirer,
that kind of stuff. Yeah. It was always in those, and he's an alien now and he's flying around the spaceship.
Yeah, it's mad. But there's Facebook groups, massive Facebook groups of, like, there could be tens of thousands of people in them that show evidence that Elvis is alive today. They strongly believe Elvis is still alive. And I actually know of one group where the admin says that she won't tell who she is or give any details about herself, but she's in contact with Elvis every day. She's very close to him.
Oh.
And every couple of days she starts the day off by posting a message directly from Elvis to the fans in this group, which I have to admit is very nice of her now. But it's just, there's extremes, like there's having fun with the idea that, he faked his death and, went off to live a happy life. But then there's the extremes. There's the fanatics who like strongly believe in that he is still alive, you know, and they go overboard.
Yeah.
But
so is it a fact that they can't accept that he died? Is that probably Elvis
probably
was
is
bigger than life, and he couldn't have died? You know, I don't believe it. That's probably a big part of it. I'd say.
Yeah, you know, he was so. I think he was a very easy celebrity to get obsessed with. You know, now I'm not talking like a stalker, but obsessed in a healthy way, if there is such a thing. You know,
a normal fan way.
Yeah, exactly.
Gravitate towards music and all that. Yeah,
I think for any of the ones that were alive back then, to wake up one day and hear that this person, your favorite singer, who you've never seen or maybe you have seen in concert, and they're young, they're 42. You get up one day and they're gone. Yeah. You know, people back then would have never thought that was going to happen for at least another 30, 40 years, you know. And I'm sure for some of them it almost felt like a family member had died, you know.
Yeah.
So,
and they say that if you were alive at the time, everyone would remember where they were when they heard that Elvis had died.
Yeah.
It's like, I suppose in our generation, you remember where you were when you were told that 9/11 happened, let's say.
Exactly.
So it's a similar, or like when JFK was shot or something like that. It's just, you
a
heard when Elvis
event.
died. Global event. It was news, the king is dead. That was like the headline all over the world. Of course, we never said about, whenever he left the building after a gig, he always announced, Elvis has left the building.
Yeah.
And he used to hop out off the stage straight into a car and gone.
He'd be gone before the music even starts.
Yeah.
Or before the music even stops. Yeah.
So yeah, when he died, like he left the building for good. And but then it's basically, he was a huge icon in his time. He was a cultural phenomenon. He started rock and roll, and he was just bigger than life. And of course that it lives on today. He's like one of the very few musicians, like we've mentioned before. Like you've had the Beatles, you have Michael Jackson, you've had these. There's very few other musicians or artist bands that are on that same level. I suppose Elvis is not even on that level. He was way above them, I suppose, in a way as well. And so it's part of what kind of drove him so, you know, to be so despaired towards the end of his life was that he had no one on his same wavelength. He had no one, say, even in the Beatles, they were like one of the biggest bands in the world, but there was four of them and they kind of all relate to each other. They had that camaraderie. But Elvis was on his own. He didn't have anyone to bounce ideas off. He never asked for advice, apparently, as well. You had to come to him and say, hey, Elvis, I'm thinking maybe you could do this song and do this, and here's a game plan. What do you think? Yeah. But he'd never ask you advice. He'd never go, Brian, what's this song? You know, what do you think of this song? Do you think it's good or whatever? He'd go with it. And he was basically larger than life. And obviously, it does keep going to today that when you look at Elvis impersonators, they're still massive. I think we mentioned earlier on about the Las Vegas chapels where you can get married by an Elvis impersonator.
Yeah, that's a major industry in itself, like between the chapels, but you also have the guys that'll put on concerts, you know, as Elvis. Like that's amazing, and that'll always live on because it's as close as you're going to get to actually seeing Elvis in person.
Yeah.
You know?
And even there's conventions all over the world. Well, obviously, maybe not in more recent times, but there'd be conventions, there'd be contests, there'd be even Southeast Asia. There's massive competitions to find an Elvis impersonator.
Yeah. And
even though he's never there, he never visited, but he's absolutely massive over in Southeast Asia to this day. And there's, you know, obviously so many films that were made off the back of Elvis. I know like two that come to mind were, I suppose, they're more independent of obscure films like 3,000 Miles to Graceland, where
I love that one.
Yeah, you've Kurt Russell and you've Nicolas Cage, and they're robbing a bank dressed as Elvis with the jumpsuits, and then you had like Bubba Hotep was
another good one,
the guy from the Evil Dead. What's his name?
Bruce Campbell.
Bruce Campbell, yeah. He's Elvis. I think he didn't die back then, but he went into hiding and he paid another guy to, portray him or something like that, and then
they
ends
were
up in a nursing
supposed to swap
home
back, but your man died or something, wasn't it?
something like that, yeah.
And then isn't there a black guy with him who's JFK?
Oh yeah, he thinks he's JFK
in the wheelchair, yeah. That he faked his death as well and dyed his skin.
Yeah. So there's some two very obscure Elvis film related suggestions. Maybe not the best films ever made, but they're interesting to say the least.
They're entertaining anyway.
Entertaining. But I suppose you've coming to the end of our Ginny Mac. We're nearly coming up to 2 hours. This is probably the longest episode of Copper's Corner. Is there anything more you want to add to, I suppose, the story of Elvis? Any other anecdotes that you might have or anything like that?
Yeah. His last concert, I think it was in Indianapolis. The guitar that he used on stage. Have you ever heard this story?
I don't think so.
So he was walking off stage, and we mentioned Ginger.
Yes,
already.
His girlfriend at the time of his death. Yeah.
Yeah. So his brother, or her brother, worked for Elvis. He had been a cop, and he'd got injured, I think, and he was off for a while, and he started being a bodyguard. And Elvis asked him would he come full time, so he eventually did. So he became his bodyguard, and he was at the last concert working. And when he came out, Elvis handed him the guitar and said, "Here, this is for you as a gift."
Wow.
He brought it home, put it in his closet, thought nothing of it. I think it was like a month later Elvis died. And for years he could never bring himself to look at this guitar.
Yeah.
But he ended up being contacted years later anyway and asking would he sell it. And I think he sold it for like $2,000, something small.
Oh no.
Yeah, and he paid off. He'd paid off his college fees, and he always says that Elvis helped put him through college. He went back and he studied to be a lawyer. But then this guitar got sold to, I think it was the National Enquirer, and they done a competition. But that guitar now is valued at like probably $100,000, if not
at
more.
Least. Yeah.
When
you said he sold it for 2,000, I was like, I died inside a little bit, because it'd be worth, like, that guitar would be worth maybe 2,000 new if you were to buy a new one of that model. That particular model being Elvis's last, live guitar. I'd say now it's worth hundreds of thousands, but perhaps.
Yeah, but that guy
plus thousands
actually was interesting. So he went to college, studied to be a lawyer after Elvis died. He went into the entertainment industry as an entertainment lawyer, and he ended up being the head of one of the divisions of Sony in America.
Right. And
he launched the careers of, I can't remember them off the top of my head now, but some very big solo singers as well in the 90s.
Yeah.
He launched their careers, he discovered them and all that. So it's weird how he decided to go into the music industry then after, he was a cop, then he was Elvis's bodyguard.
Yeah.
Stuff like that. But another funny one about him is when Elvis started going out with his sister, he met the brother obviously and got on well with him. And he used to invite him motorbike riding, motorbike racing, whatever, that all the guys would have their own motorbike and, they'd take off, could be in the middle of the night, drive around for hours. And he didn't like motorbikes. And so he started thinking of excuses why he couldn't go and it'd never work. One of them was that he'd broke his leg while on duty and he was off for a while. So Elvis bought, I think, like a side cart so he could still come on the rides. But then he started using the excuse, I live too far away, it's 2:00 in the morning, I'm not getting up to come over to Graceland. He goes, fine. A week later, he went over and picked up him and his wife, brought him for a drive over to Graceland, but stopped on the street just before Graceland, drove up, and there's a lot of houses built here.
Let's see where this is going.
Yeah, yeah. He stopped at a house and he was like, I just want to go in here and meet someone. You coming in? So Elvis walked in. The guy walked in. There was no one there. And he was like, have a look around. He's probably late. So they looked around, right? And came back. Oh, it's a lovely house. Grand. Glad you like it. It's yours. I've bought it for you. Don't worry about anything. And he turned around to him and he goes, so he handed the wife the keys to the house and he was like, I hope you're happy with it. And he goes, you come with me, come out to the garage. He walked out into the garage and there was a brand new, like 1976 Harley Davidson motorbike. He goes, now you live alongside me and you have a brand new bike. You have no excuses.
You can't get out of it anymore.
Yeah.
Your man hated it to begin with.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
He's, I don't think there'll be anyone like Elvis ever again.
I don't think so.
Absolute icon.
It really says something. It really says something when like people that you would consider legends hold him as a legend. You know, like Paul McCartney looks up to Elvis, you know, and you know how the world feels about Paul McCartney. You know, Bruce Springsteen, you know, Bob Dylan. They all look up to Elvis, you know, and they drew inspiration from Elvis, or Elvis made them want to be singers.
Yeah,
you know?
Absolutely. I think the funny thing about Bob Dylan, I think Elvis did like Bob Dylan's music. He liked the lyrics, he liked the songs, how the songs made him feel, but he didn't like Bob Dylan's voice, which I can kind of relate to, because it is a kind of original type of a voice, I suppose you could say. But I no doubt we'll probably be covering Bob Dylan on this podcast at some stage.
Without a doubt, at some stage, I'd say.
But I think we'll have to leave it there. I think there's so much that we could have covered, and there'll probably be diehard fans of Elvis listening to this thinking, oh, you didn't mention that, or you didn't mention this, and we apologize. We can't, possibly cover everything that ever occurred with Elvis, let's say. But there are some, like, I suppose I watched in anticipation of this, a little bit of research. I watched The Searcher, the HBO documentary. Kind of hard to find, but if you have your means of finding things, you can find them. But it's really, really good documentary if people want to go and, I suppose, go further into Elvis's life. This is all, if, some people might listen to this for the first time and only hear the story for the first time, and now they might go on further and delve into the music like I will now. I suppose I had a passing knowledge, as I said, of Elvis, and obviously you know who he was, and everyone knows who he was, but I didn't go into his life as much, and after doing all the research, I'm, well more on board with Elvis. And same thing happened to me with Neil Young as well. I wasn't very familiar with Neil Young, and I think it was my second episode, and then I went all the research, and I'm like, big fan of Neil Young now, so it's kind of...
Really?
Yeah, it does that to you. You become more familiar with the person and the story, and obviously the music then as well. And I hope that's what people are getting from this podcast as well. It opens them up to new stories and basically histories of these people that they'd known all their lives that they didn't necessarily know about, and kind of supposed to relate to them a bit more. But enough for me, I suppose. If people want to listen to Brian and his amazing podcast, The Concerts That Made Us, tell them again where they can find you. Yeah,
well, before I do that, just want to say thanks for asking me on. I had a great time, and I'm always looking for an excuse to talk about Elvis. But and it's a great thing you're doing with the podcast. I've listened to the other episodes now and truly enjoyed them. I think I was saying it to you before. It's the first podcast I've listened to in a long time where, as soon as an episode is finished, I need the next episode. So you're definitely onto a good thing.
Thanks very much.
No problem. But yeah, if people want to find me, I'm on all social media at Concerts That Made Us Podcast. We're on all the podcast players as well. And the website as well at www.concertsthatmadeus.com.
Yeah, you just made that website recently enough as well, isn't it? It's kind of
the last 2 months, I'd say it's new enough. So still working through a few things with it, but it's doing the job.
It's doing the job, yeah, exactly. And so best luck to you and your future podcast endeavors, and I'm sure we'll be chatting to each other again and in a podcast form someday.
More than likely.
Absolutely. And so for those still listening to the end of this, we're probably reaching 2 hours now, which is the longest episode. Thanks very much for listening. Of course, if you want to follow the podcast, go over to social media. We have Facebook and Instagram at Copper's Corner Podcast. I have my own stuff, Copper Kelly Music. I have my music and Instagram and all that kind of stuff on Spotify and all those good places. And if you want to, again, support the podcast itself, because we are both independent podcasters. We don't have Spotify behind us giving us 100 million like Joe Rogan, or there's so many of these companies now that are, as NPR and all these, like Tom Hanks gets his own podcast about, the Band of Brothers now and all this kind of, there's no financial backing behind what we do. So if you can help us out at all, and I know Brian is going to be launching a Patreon soon, so go over and follow his podcast and have a listen to that whenever he launches that. But if you want to go to Patreon and help support the podcast, you can go to patreon.com/Copper's Corner Podcast. And you can give $1 a month or €1 a month or whatever it is. And that keeps keeps the fires burning and the wheels turning and, keeps us going, as I say, keeps us in coffee and beer and such. But again, thanks very much for coming on, Brian.
Thanks for having me.
Brilliant. I really hope you enjoyed yourself and I hope the listeners enjoyed it too. And I suppose we'll say goodbye for now and we'll see you next time. So say goodbye to the lovely people, Brian.
Bye, folks. We'll see you next time.
Brilliant. All the best. We'll see you next week. Bye-bye.